Good afternoon from the Philippines. Good morning and good evening to friends and guests who are joining us from other parts of the globe. My name is Jean Hard de Harris, the Program Manager for Climate and Disaster Resilience in the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and I will be serving as your host for today's event. It's my honor to welcome you all to Open Climate Science, a panel discussion on the meanings and practice of open science. This webinar is part of the Climate Research as If People Mattered series, which began last year with a series of webinars from November to December, and which we hope to continue. We are delighted to see some familiar names join us in today's event. It's great to have you with us again. If this is your first time joining one of our webinars, we hope that you stick around and hopefully become part of the My Climate Risk community. This webinar is organized by the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, which is hosted by the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. We would like to thank the Manila Observatory and the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines through the Climate and Disaster Resilience Innovations Program of the Anthropological and Sociological Initiatives of the Ateneo. We'd also like to thank the My Climate Risk Hubs of the University of Reading through the Walker Institute and the University of Cape Town through the Climate System Analysis Group. We are thankful as well to Living Laudato Si Philippines and Aksyon Prima Pilipinas. Today's webinar seeks to facilitate a meaningful discussion between panel members who will articulate and navigate the tensions of the meanings and practice of open science in addressing climate change. We hope to dig deep into these concepts in today's discussion. Just some reminders before we start. Please note that the program is being recorded on Zoom. On Zoom, all participants are muted automatically as they enter the meeting room. Throughout the session, kindly type in any comments or questions in the chat box here on Zoom. Participants via Facebook Live may also type in their comments or questions in the comment section. We will collect these for the open forum later on. And there will be an evaluation survey at the end of the session. Requests for e-certificates may be made through the same form. At this point, we would like to ask everyone to settle in for the prayer to be followed by the Philippine National Anthem. Interfaith prayer for our climate. All-sustaining Spirit, you encircle space and time. You swirl and sing through every season. In silent stillness, you settle deep into the soul of creation. Your sacred wisdom has come to us this day in the words of ancient truth, through the words of present-day prophets, for the ones whose future well-being is formed by our response today. May our actions be formed by what has been spoken and heard and felt here today. Make us wise and faithful stewards of creation, sustained by your Spirit forevermore. Amen.
Magiliw, kailan sa sinanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisiin. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bukaw, may nilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdiningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhating pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang hinigaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Now, to formally welcome everyone to today's webinar, I am pleased to call on Dr. Charlotte Kendra Gotanco Gonzalez, the Director of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability and focal point of the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, to deliver the opening remarks.
Good afternoon, colleagues and friends, and welcome to our webinar on open climate science. We are confronted with a very interesting and nuanced question today, which is perhaps equal parts philosophical, sociological, as it is scientific. What makes climate science open? UNESCO has stated that open science should work towards making the scientific process more transparent, inclusive, and democratic. And for that reason, this is a question that concerns not just the practitioners of science, but larger society in general. So I can imagine that we might approach this question of openness from different perspectives. For example, from the perspective of people, we might ask who are able to participate in this endeavor we call science or scientific research. Is it limited to those with formal training? Are we espousing co-production? Are citizen science initiatives part of what makes science open? We might speak about openness in terms of the tools of research. Are the software and the models we use open source? We might highlight the outcomes of research and their usability, that the research products can be translated into appropriate actions in the hands of key stakeholders. And what about communicating the research? Open access journals, already a salient question in the sciences. But beyond that, have other means been explored to share research outcomes, modes, and media that are more widely used outside of scientific circles? And what about the language being used? Writing that is full of specialized jargon tends to be opaque to those outside of the discipline. So our efforts in science communication, part of what makes science open if we're talking about transparency and inclusivity. So this is indeed a multi-dimensional discussion, and we are fortunate to have with us today a diverse panel with experiences spanning the different sectors, from the academe and research to national and local government, non-government organizations, and the private sector. I know that in the time that we have, we can't possibly answer all the questions that the concept of open science might raise, but I hope that we can at least catalyze some reflection that might later lead to new and innovative ways of practice. So with that, let's get the ball rolling.
Good day, everyone. My name is Daniel Retilla. I'll be stepping in momentarily for Miss Jean Hardelesa Mijares. I'm from the Ateneo Institute, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Gotanco Gonzalez for welcoming us to the webinar and for setting the atmosphere for today's panel discussion. It is now my honor to introduce the esteemed members of our panel. Our first panelist is Mr. John Leo C. Algo, or JL, who is the Deputy Executive Director for Programs and Campaigns of the faith-based movement Living Laudato Si Philippines and a member of the Interim Secretariat of Aksyon Klima Pilipinas, the country's largest civil society network for climate action. He is also a member of the Youth Advisory Group for Environmental and Climate Justice under the UNDP in Asia and the Pacific. He has represented Philippine civil society and the youth sector in regional and global conferences under the UNEP and UNFCCC since 2017 and is named as one of the Environmental Education or EE 30 Under 30 class of 2022 by the North American Association for Environmental Education. Our next panel speaker is Dr. Christopher D. Jack. Dr. Jack has a background in computer science and ocean and atmospheric science. Over the past 20 years, he has also built extensive experience in science-society engagement and communications, and more recently, decision-making under uncertainty and multi- and transdisciplinary research. He has been involved in a mix of consulting and advisory activities, as well as academic research activities in partnerships with networks across the globe. His current research activities are focused on the intersection of urban context and climate risk through projects such as Fractal, where his background and experience in fundamental climate science and modeling, as well as in decision support and capacity development, come together. He is co-director of the Climate System Analysis Group at the University of Cape Town, as well as science advisor for the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. His passion is working with and across diverse disciplines and areas of expertise in complex problem spaces, hence his current interest in urban climate resilience in developing contexts. Our next panelist is Ms. Fiona Spuller. Ms. Spuller is a PhD student at the University of Reading, working with Dr. Marlene Kretschmer and Dr. Ted Shepard on improving seasonal forecasts using causal models of atmospheric teleconnections in collaboration with the Walker Institute. She worked for 2 years at a nonprofit organization on the alignment of the European financial sectors with climate mitigation goals. Last year, she was part of an international fellowship program by the German Foreign Ministry working on finance for resilience and loss and damage with different organizations. She co-developed an open source Python package for the comparison and evaluation of statistical bias adjustment methods of climate models as part of the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts Summer of Weather Code 2022. Next, we have Dr. Noraline Uy. Dr. Uy is a climate and disaster risk management specialist and a licensed environmental planner, currently serving as technical advisor at the Office of the Secretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources in the Philippines. Dr. Uy has been engaged in various projects for the Asian Development Bank, United Nations Development Program, the German Agency for International Cooperation, and the American and German Red Cross. She has published journal articles and book chapters in internationally released books and serves as peer reviewer for various journals and as a technical evaluator for the Department of Science and Technology, Philippine Council for Agriculture, Aquatic and Natural Resources Research and Development. And finally, our fifth panelist is Father Jose Ramon Villarin of the Society of Jesus. Father Villarin is the Executive Director of the Manila Observatory. He holds a PhD in Atmospheric Sciences from Georgia Tech, a Master of Science in Physics from Marquette University, and a Bachelor of Science in Physics from Ateneo de Manila. His past commitments include serving as President of the Ateneo de Manila University and as member of the National Panel of Technical Experts of the Climate Change Commission of the Philippines. He was also lead reviewer of the UNFCCC, in which capacity he audited the greenhouse gas emissions of developed countries, and was a member of the UN Consultative Group of Experts, which helped strengthen the capacity of developing countries to deal with climate change. He was also a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a global group of scientists that received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 with former US Vice President Al Gore. He is coordinating lead author of the 2016 Philippine Climate Change Assessment, The Physical Science Basis, which was written with several Filipino scientists to evaluate the state of climate science in the country. He continues to chair Synergia, an NGO dedicated to public education reform in the Philippines. Please join me in welcoming our panel members by giving them a virtual round of applause. Mr. Algo, Dr. Jack, Ms. Spuller, Dr. Uy, and Father Villarin, welcome and thank you for being here. To start the discussion, we now invite the members of our panel to share some initial reflections, and we will first hear from Mr. John Leo Algo.
Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel for this afternoon. And I'll keep my intervention a bit short. And I'll also be speaking from the perspective of someone who spent years being trained in the natural sciences, especially on the climate and air quality side, and now finds himself working within the realms of the NGO world. So I'd like to start my initial reflection by, well, remembering remembering one of the most important quotes that I heard in my life so far. And it was said to me by a former boss of mine, who said to me about what the purpose of science really should be. And she said to me and to her other students at the time that the goal of science is to be in service of the development of society. That, of course, those may not be the exact words she said, but that's basically the spirit of it. And when I remember that quote, I always think of what the purpose of science is, not just in terms of, do you just produce research or something like that, or do you want to make sure that the outputs of your years of hard work will really make a difference to a particular community, even a household, some individuals, or even on the national or global scale. And in the context of climate science, for example, it is no secret that the speed of climate action currently, you can say the global level, the national level, whatever scale you think of, it's not matching the rate of climate change itself. And I've always, in all of my engagements, we always say to stakeholders that we talk to that you can't have solutions, you can't develop solutions without understanding the issues that you're dealing with in the first place. And of course, that is based on the findings of numerous scientific studies, which is very important, of course, when tackling the climate crisis. So we also think about, since we're talking about open science here, about who really needs to be affected by the outputs of your research the most. Who is your target audience? Like, why are you doing this? So, of course, from the perspective of the advocacy, you always want your research to impact in a positive way the most vulnerable communities, indigenous peoples, women, farmers, etc. And you always have to consider whether or not they can access these data, these findings, even the methodologies in certain ways of producing data and collecting them and analyzing them. And do you want it to be as inclusive as possible as well? So that's another point that I like to highlight. And then, of course, from an NGO perspective, we always make sure that whenever we engage with, for example, a UN agency, some sectors of the Philippine government, a vulnerable community, or any other stakeholder, we always emphasize these terms: science-based, needs-based, evidence-based. Of course, those three terms, they are linked, but they don't necessarily mean the same thing. But they all allude to the fact that, again, all of your advocacies, all of your calls or recommendations you're going to present are based on evidence, are based on observations that you actually have collected from the sources where you need to find them. So for me, all of those elements represent, in the context of open science, how science should be in service of the development of society. And of course, we're going to hear later from my fellow panelists as well about what they think are the goals of open science, the technicalities even. But for me, the goals of open science should include the following. Like, for example, of course, accelerating scientific progress, especially in the context of the climate crisis. It's the foundation for developing solutions. You got to have outputs, you got to have research, you got to have studies. At the global level, I would say, compared to the Philippine level, for example, the findings at the global level are more adequate, I believe, based on my observations now, compared to the Philippine level. And maybe if we have time later, I can probably divulge more into why that is from my perspective. But another goal of open science, of course, improving the verifiability of research quality and increasing trust. That's the point of the inclusivity for me. Of course, avoid wasting resources, reducing inequalities in accessing to the different aspects of the scientific method, basically the research process, from hypothesis to data collection all the way to publication even. And again, in line with the goal of making science in service of the people, you want to make the research publicly available because you want it to lead to concrete policy developments or the formation of solutions, tangible solutions that will truly benefit those who need it the most. Of course, these are based from my observations now. If you want to make open science more mainstream, quote unquote, more popular, I think it also has something to do with addressing the challenges that the scientific community itself is facing. Like, if, for example, your research culture, you have issues with, for example, there are certain situations where researchers may face heavy workloads, or there may be issues with data sharing between two particular groups. Even a bit of a reputational risk even can be a part of that problem. Like, if you want to make open science more mainstream, you have to address the problems associated with the research culture itself, because those are intertwined. You can't just isolate one aspect and expect it to not affect the other. And then, of course, I think it's also important to improve digital literacy and communications. One of the things that the pandemic, which by the way we still are in technically, that has taught us is the importance of being able to use digital modes of communication even more so. And I think it's important not just for, of course, researchers and scientists, but also as many stakeholders as possible to be well-versed in social media, for example, to be well-versed in other modes of online communication as well. And among other concerns for lower research quality, because you're opening the methods or the databases to more stakeholders, that might be some concern as well. Lack of investments and political will for spearheading open science-related development. And this is not just limited to, the typical response here in the Philippines that, we lack policies on a governance level. But I think even within certain institutions, at the institutional level, you also have to have investments. You have to have certain rules and procedures that also are related to, whatever research culture related problems an institution may have. That also needs to be addressed. And lastly, I think there's also needs to be a stronger presence of scientists and researchers on the public science policymaking nexus. Because if you want to make, for example, if you want to make open science more mainstream, then scientists have to be the ones leading the charge on that, in my opinion. They have to be more active in popularizing science itself, because of course that comes with different challenges in itself. But if the public can sense a stronger presence of the scientific community on issues related to poverty, sustainable development, for example, since we're talking about climate change here, we're talking how about renewable energy, energy issues, the cost of electricity, things like that, they will become more receptive to being more involved in certain processes related to research. So I will end my opening intervention on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, JL, for sharing your initial thoughts, already starting the conversation about the what, the who, and the how for open science. We will now hear next from Dr. Christopher Jack.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm just going to share, I've got a few slides. Great, hope you can see that. Sorry, my video seems a bit jumpy, so I hope it's okay for everybody else. Maybe I'll just turn it off while I'm presenting. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the introductory input from JL. That's a really nice starting point. And I think I want to pick up on that, particularly on your last point around the involvement of scientists in these different spaces. And I think that's really important. I think I'll build on that. So I wanted to kind of reframe the title a little bit. A lot of the My Climate Risk is sort of framed in this phrase as if people mattered. And I often, in my head, I switch it around a little bit to say climate research as if people are experts. And I'd like to unpack that a little bit. But before I do that, hang on, what's going on now? I wanted to step back and say, so what is the big problem? And the previous speaker spoke a little bit about this from a certain angle, and I think I'll build on that. I think we often talk about this challenge of science informing society, and often in this sort of science world, we think, how can we make sure that the science makes it into decision making, or we kind of mainstream it into decision making? So we have this idea of trying to kind of wedge the science more strongly into decision making, and a whole lot of problems have been identified around this, and I'm just putting a few of them out here. So one of the ones that comes up often is that the science or the information is too hard to access, and again, this speaks to a lot of the sort of open science movements, and so that some of the solutions around that are that we make it more accessible. So another open data portal or platform. I have built one of these myself, so I'm not against them. I think they have a lot of potentially have a lot of value, but it is often a sort of first go-to to say, well, make it more accessible, so we create an open data platform, allow people to access that data. It's not a bad thing. It's part of the solution, but I think there's more to it. There's also the problem of the science being too difficult to understand or interpret. So how do we make it open for more people to engage with if it's too difficult to understand? So there's been a lot of focus on better communication of the science, so very innovative ways of visualizing science outputs. And again, I think this is really valuable. I'm very pro communication of science. I'm very interested in visualization approaches. So it's part of the solution. Another key one is that there are too many different sources of science. There's different science groups and different science institutions around the world within different countries. Which one is the right one? Where do we go to get the science to inform society? And so one of the solutions there is often to have one central repository or authority. So on a national scale, a number of countries have a sort of national climate information platform or authority or structure that provides that science information to inform society. Globally, obviously, we have institutions or structures such as the IPCC and others that create this sort of single authority. Again, part of the solution, but a lot of questions there as well. Another big one is the science is too uncertain. So we need more precise information before it can be used to inform societal decision-making. And one of the solutions proposed here is we need to reduce the uncertainty. We first need to do more research in our labs, in our computer models, to reduce that uncertainty before we can kind of introduce it into society. So this is one framing what the big problem is and some of the approaches to solving these problems. And again, I think these are all valid parts of the solution. I keep getting this wrong, sorry. But I think there's an underlying challenge, which is something I want to speak to today. So this is, I'm sure there'll be some discussion here, but this is one way that I picture it in my head. We have stuff that we see on the surface of science. We have, particularly in climate science, we have lots of modeling, climate models being run. We have lots of data, increasing amounts of data. We have lots of analysis methods to analyze that data, to translate it into hazard information, risk information, and so on. So that's all the stuff that we kind of see on the surface in data platforms, in publications, and so on. But what's under the surface is becoming increasingly important to me. And I think it's a much bigger part of the problem and the solution. And this is where we find questions of relationships. Who do you trust? How do you build trust between people? And how do you build trust in the information, in the science, and in the science process? So relationships and trust are really key. Meaning making. What does this mean in my context? What does it mean for somebody working in an informal settlement in a city in Africa? What does the science mean for that context? agency, what do you do with it? So you may have open science, you may have very accessible science, you might even be able to make some sense of it in different contexts, but what do you do with it? What is my agency? How am I going to act on that? Diversity is a really key one, and hopefully we can talk quite a bit about this. There are diverse experiences of climate impacts in the context in which we're working, and there are diverse ways of understanding that. I think one of the biggest struggles for me has been learning how to hold that diversity and accept that there are different ways of understanding what people are experiencing. There sometimes that conflicts with some of the more quote unquote scientific evidence. How do we hold that in a trust sort of space and relationships? And then there are deep, this is where I put it low down, there are deep unknowables. Often when we get down to actual decision making in these very complicated contexts, I work a lot in cities in Africa, there are deep unknowables, things we just don't know and we don't understand. And science is uncomfortable in those spaces often. So we need to learn how to hold that. And then the last two are really key, is around ownership and responsibility. So we can talk about bringing science more into society, into decision-making, making it more open, but ultimately, who's responsible for the decisions that are made? Who owns the process? Who owns the knowledge construction? And who's responsible when things go wrong or when mistakes are made? And that's a really important question I think we need to unpack further. Okay, a little bit of a step back. I'm going to go quickly here, but a few years ago, we still run an annual, we call it a winter school here in Cape Town in the Southern Hemisphere, which is a week-long or 2-week-long professional course on climate risk management. And I often found myself answering participants' questions with the answer, it's complicated, or it's too complicated. And I started reflecting on my answer and realizing I'm actually hiding behind this answer of it's complicated. And often there is complexity. So on the left there, it's an expression of the Euler-Lagrangian equations. You know, these are complicated things, and we're not necessarily going to explain it to a lot of people. So there is complexity there. But I think often as scientists, I had to realize that I was hiding behind my statement of it's too complicated, you're not going to understand it, just leave it up to us kind of expression. And I think what I started realizing is what we can really make visible and transparent is what are the assumptions that are being made. There are assumptions behind the Euler equations and their application in climate science. Okay, maybe that's a little bit abstract, but there are many, many other assumptions that we make in climate science, and we can make those visible and open. There's a lot of assumptions. When you come down into particular context, that's what this little Venn diagram is meant to be, those assumptions become very real. And then the implications of these assumptions. So what is the assumption of making some assumption around cloud microphysics in a climate model? What assumptions are being made? But what are the implications of these assumptions? You cannot answer that question unless you understand the context in which that information might be being used. So for me, this was kind of foundational to say, I can't actually answer these questions of what are the implications of these assumptions unless we're deeply engaged in the context in which that's going to be used. And again, it comes down to who manages the risks in making these assumptions and who is responsible for making these assumptions. So this is a lot of the work that I've dived into. Okay, so then we think, okay, as scientists, we must co-produce, we must work with stakeholders, we must work with people on the ground. So we do, we spend time in context. The picture on the left is we've done a lot of work in Lusaka, spend time in those contexts, and we must co-produce, and we must get, what we often get to is what are the user needs? So what science is needed, and then we'll go back to our labs and we'll provide that science. And I've become increasingly frustrated with kind of user needs assessments because it really is much deeper than that. And on the right, there's a figure of a process where we try to map out some storylines with a rope on a large floor and figure out what are the storylines that are taking place within this context, and what are the questions that are emerging, and what is the knowledge that is already there and the decisions that are already being made, and realizing there aren't user needs, there aren't nice, neatly captured needs within this process. It really is a much more complicated relational trust-based process. So we do a lot of these kind of things, a lot of mapping, a lot of participatory processes, trying to collectively build knowledge together. I really like
Sorry,
the
Dr.
figure on
Jack,
the right here.
just to keep the time, 2 minutes left. Thank
Yes,
you.
got one more slide. So the process on the right here, my title was saying as if people were experts, and this is a process where we really drew on the expertise in a room, very diverse, from people living in communities to water resource managers, and trying to build all that expertise together into a pool of knowledge that we're working with. And people are experts. People know their context, and they know a lot about the risks that they face and some of the solutions that need to be pursued. And here we tried to do something very different. So here a colleague of mine, Richard Jones from the Met Office, and I, we actually presented climate projections, and we asked the people in the room, to make decisions around which models to exclude, how to manage uncertainty, the kind of thing that seems impossible. But when you actually try it, you actually ask the questions, you make the assumptions transparent and clear, and you allow people to engage with those, we can actually make real progress. So last slide, it's about humble science, building some humility in the science, and about balancing the power that comes with science, which is something I'd love to talk about more. It is about transparency and accessibility, not accessibility, the ability to assess the assumptions and the implications of those. Very much about building trust in evidence, but also building trust in people, surfacing values and ethics, and then creating meaning from data. And I'd like to end with a little quote from a participant in one of these processes that said, "This is the first time I've actually understood what climate change means for my city after going through this kind of open, trust-built, transparent process." I'm not saying we've got it all right. We're still learning. I'd love to learn from others, but open to lots of discussion. Thanks. Sorry for going on a bit long.
No problem. Thank you very much, Dr. Jack. Would love to hear more. Maybe we can expound further, especially on the process of co-production. But thank you so much on the empowering note on people as experts. Next, we now hand the virtual floor over to Ms. Fiona Spuller.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very honored to be here. And also thank you to the two previous speakers. I think, yeah, I found a lot of the points really interesting, and I look forward to the discussion. So I also brought along some slides, so I'll share them. Give me one moment. Does this work scale-wise?
Yes,
or should I?
Okay, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so we're discussing quite a big and very important topic here today. And when I was sitting down and thinking about what input to bring to these opening remarks, I thought I could bring one thought, one idea, question, and one topic for discussion. And all of these three things that I bring are based on my personal experience, because I thought that would enable me to speak more concretely of what I know, but it's of course sort of limited to the spaces that I've worked in. So the first point that I want to make is just maybe reminder or consideration, and that is on the non-neutrality of climate information or usability. So when we talk about usability, we often assume that this is something that inherently brings about positive change. So if climate science is made more open and more usable, who would not benefit? But the point that I want to argue is that, or that sort of I've seen and experienced in my previous work, is that climate information will be used according to the rules and norms with which an institution, a government, or actually any organization works already. So an example of this is the incorporation of climate risk information into sovereign credit ratings. So institutions, just to quickly walk you through this, so institutions such as Moody's rate countries' ability to pay back their loans, which influences how high the interest rates are which countries have to pay. And in the last years, these rating agencies, as well as insurance companies and central banks, have sort of started to see climate change as a financially material risk. So at the last COP, they actually announced that they now are incorporating climate risk into their ratings. And how good this methodology is another question, but the fact that they're doing it already means that in the future, and perhaps already now, countries that are more climate vulnerable have a more difficult time accessing finance, which sort of stands in stark contrast to any idea of climate justice. So this is maybe the starkest example that I've come across in my work, and there's many ways to address this, for example, by reforming the sovereign rating system and so on. But because we're focusing on the role of science here, I just want to bring this example to make the point that wherever climate information is made usable, we have to expect it to be used according to the current sort of rules and incentives of that system. So I think the question that we should put at the center of our discussion is sort of climate science or open science for whom, or for whom are we developing science, or what does society mean if we say science for society. So on the one hand side, so if we take just financial institution on the one hand side who has the budget to build their own department on climate risk, who is a sort of financially attractive employer for academics who finance research projects across the UK. And on the other side, a climate vulnerable community. I think we have to sort of center our question on how can we make it more, how can we make open science more accessible to those who don't already have access. So the second point that I want to bring is more of a question, and I think that question is, what role can open software play? And in my in my view, the status quo is that methodologies to assess bottom-up climate risk are still being developed and are difficult to scale beyond the research groups or projects in which they're developed. And I think building on what Dr. Jack said, I think there's a lot more than just sort of creating an open data portal, and I would love to talk about this more, because I think that open source software can be built in a collaborative effort. There are parts of maybe what we do as scientists that can be encoded into software that can make it usable beyond the projects that we're immediately involved in. But there is the question of whether this addresses the things below the iceberg, whether it enforces existing power structures and so on. And I think the last point is really sort of just bringing those things together and bringing into the discussion the question of what the incentives are that drive the academic community that might keep us from spending months on an open source software project, that might keep us from being involved with communities beyond the period where we can sort of produce papers from it, the types of positions available in academia. So I think I just want to leave with that topic that I would love to discuss further.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fuller. Really highlighted very importantly what can drive the community for collaboration and the involvement we can have with them, with the tools that we are developing, especially with the open software. It's very interesting. We hope to hear more about that later on during the open forum. We now move to our fourth panel member, Dr. Lenny.
Thank you, Jean. Good day, everyone. So I am coming from the perspective of a climate and disaster risk reduction practitioner. So my short intervention today would be based on my experience working with local governments and conducting research with communities. Data, information, and research on the ground have always been a challenge when we do our work. When we go down to the local level, we often find a lack of contextual information, especially for baselining purposes or there can be scientific data and research available, but are not consumed, so to speak. So they do not feed into the analysis or planning processes. There are also several holders of information, like in the case of the local government unit. Every office may hold different kinds of information that is not easily accessible or shared with other offices. On their own, local governments often do not have the capacity, time, or resources for a comprehensive search for information that is available. Although the Philippines has open data and freedom of information policies, there is still limited data published by the government, and the process of accessing them can take time. Also, even with technical support from academia and development partners provided to our local governments, the consideration of scientific articles in policymaking can be hindered by a paywall. Now, with regard to communities, there is the issue of the digital divide and the challenges of access and awareness. More often than not, they will not know of any advances in science unless someone or something intervenes and exposes them to that knowledge. Any scientific knowledge can be intimidating if not translated or presented in a way that is understandable to them, for them to take home, to use and share with others in the community. Local knowledge should also not be disregarded, especially those that, when combined with scientific knowledge, will add value to current strategies and practices. There is the practice of researchers that I find very useful. This is to conduct validation workshops for research undertaken with the community. So this is an opportunity to disseminate the scientific outputs or findings and make communities aware of new knowledge and any implications it has on them. My work largely involves support in conducting climate and disaster risk assessments or profiling, and in general, risk reduction planning that is science-informed and evidence-based. We prioritize the use of data or information generated or endorsed by technical government agencies. For example, climate change and climate issues projections from our meteorological agency, PAG-ASA, and not from any other source. We supplement it with secondary scientific information, usually which is open access, and when possible, quantitative and qualitative surveys and interviews to capture both physical and socio-economic dimensions. Understandably, there are many limitations at the local level, especially if you are a 5th or 6th class municipality. That is why we always make it a point to make use of the best available information that we can find, rather than having no information at all. On the point of open access, recently I conducted a stock taking for the midterm review of the Sendai framework, involving a systematic desk review of disaster recovery, or the Build Back Better component of Priority 4 of the Sendai framework. The search on the Scopus database alone yielded more than 6,000 articles, but we were only able to access around 1,000, with the remaining being paywalled. Now, this was a very important exercise to understand progress and achievements and the continuing challenges and barriers in disaster recovery that would have somehow provide input for potential policy adjustments and new modalities to accelerate the implementation of the Sendai framework. I think the findings and recommendations of the stock take would have been made more robust were we not limited to open access articles only. I think that as researchers, we can contribute to addressing pressing social challenges, such as climate change and disaster risk, and linking science to policy and practice by undertaking participatory, like Dr. Jack mentioned, and transdisciplinary research projects that are demand-driven and solution-oriented. We should make it a point to make scientific knowledge readily available in whatever platform available, and in a manner that will make it relevant to stakeholders. Apart from journal articles, knowledge products should be developed targeted to specific audiences. I have been involved in projects that promoted open science by making sure that all project outputs are available online and they are disseminated as widely as possible. For example, through presentations and conferences and dialogues and partnerships with government agencies and other stakeholders that will make use of the tools and methods produced by the projects. We find that involving these stakeholders at some point during the project can facilitate their uptake, leading to potential consideration in the plans or strategies of these institutions. Working at the local level, I find that it is vital that stakeholders does not only just have access to data, information, and research, but also understand its importance and how they can use it, especially if it is a way for their voices to be heard. In my engagements with local governments, we always emphasize the need to develop their technical capacity in information management so their databases can speak to one another and allow them to fully appreciate their usefulness. With communities, efforts must be made to bridge the technological and cultural gaps that may inhibit them from engaging proactively in open science. I believe developing a culture of openness requires changing the attitudes of both government and the public towards open data and increasing open science literacy. It would be critical for national governments to publish more data and information. Hopefully, there will also be more open access articles and knowledge products that are tailored to specific groups. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doc Lenny, for sharing about your experience, especially zooming into the context of working with governments and decision makers and the call for knowledge products to be more context specific to the stakeholders. And of course, last but certainly not the least, we will hear from the fifth member of our panel, Father Jeff Villarreal.
Thank you. Again, good afternoon, good morning, good day to all of us. I set myself to try answering 3 of the 4 questions. The first is the first question on open science, what I think it means, what it privileges, what it marginalizes. And then second is what hinders and enables the practice of open science. And the third and last is if I can share some cases and lessons learned, successes or failures. So let me begin by, first sharing with you what I do on the first day of my class in Science and Society. I show my students a picture of the Milky Way. And then I ask them, who took this picture? How can you draw a picture of the Milky Way if you are inside it? It's hard to see something when you're inside the thing. And of course, the point really being that this is in contrast to the positivist ethos of the so-called objective observer. The point also I would try to convey is that science is a social activity, that the scientist is embedded in culture and influenced by values and in that culture. So what is open science? Well, first I tried to describe to myself what it is not. What is closed science? And I guess closed science traditionally is science that's done by an elite group, elites, trained in certain methods of compartmentalization and idealization. Essentially like what we call the so-called scientific method. This group, they choose to be confined to what is measurable by instruments designed within their compartment or discipline. Now, this has given science its superpowers, right? It's given science its explanatory and predictive powers, especially in the physical realm. And so what does this or who does this privilege? It privileges the measured and the measurer, and it marginalizes the non-measurable and other viable constructs of reality, especially those coming from philosophy, metaphysics, theology, or even sociology, psychology, etc. This privileges the how of things, this kind of science, and not the why of things. Or perhaps this also privileges the facts more than, I guess, values. Open science, however, is still science, but it allows its interrogation of reality to be driven, modulated by social concerns. And it is conducted with other stakeholders. Now, yeah, that's another issue, co-production, right? Because a laboratory, by its very nature, is closed to outsiders. You don't want too many cooks in the kitchen, or all sorts of cooks to spoil, who might spoil the broth. And so exclusion, in a way, in science, depends on what is being brewed in the kitchen. And inclusion or open science justifies some kind of involvement of those in the dining room, because they are asking who the broth is for. Who is it for that you're slaving away in that kitchen? And I think that justifies their engagement. So much for open science. The second question is really about hindrances and obstacles. Well, my first thing about obstacle is that, well, the first obstacle is language. Technicalese. Things get lost in translation. For example, concept of average. And that's very hard to understand, average. We take that for granted. Or when meteorologists say 100-year flood, what's a 100-year flood? Or emissions versus concentration, mass per unit time versus mass per unit volume. Even the word per is not easily understood. And scientists are there, I say, well, translation is not my job. Maybe the social scientists can do that, can do a better job, but not I. Don't ask me. So the other obstacle is perhaps on the part of scientists is that there is a concern with scientific integrity and so-called accuracy and precision, or an anxiety about contamination or oversimplification. Enablers, I can think of language as well, which can be an enabler, and I think of parables or stories. When you're trying to explain or convey something complex, it helps to have analogs or analogies. In the 1990s, I was going around the country trying to explain what climate change is, more like Chicken Little saying that the sky is falling. I don't think I was making a lot of headway. Gaining traction, I don't think so, until I guess this guy Al Gore, who is a non-scientist, he comes up with this inconvenient truth. And he's not a scientist, although he has all these PowerPoints. But he tells a story about his son, and it's a personal testimony. And it becomes powerful and it gains ground. So I thought, yeah, that's the power of language, of personal witness. Another enabler is, for me, is science journalism, because these guys they're really good in translating or reducing science to bite-sized chunks that people can understand, or at least people who will make decisions can understand. I think Chris already mentioned humility, and I'd like to add self-awareness as an enabler. I know a lot to know that I don't know everything. I think it was someone said a little knowledge is the dangerous thing. You have a lot of people who, was it Alexander Pope? Anyway, but Sometimes you have a lot of people pontificating, people who really haven't wrestled with the issue. Another enabler is transdisciplinary gatherings, conversations. By transdisciplinary, I mean beyond the academic and engaging other social sectors like civil society, the private sector, the public sector, not just intra-university. That really helps. Anyway, on cases, how much time? I think I have 2 more.
So we have about a minute left, Father.
So, okay, on cases, I just wanted to point out that it really helps to have certain exercises. I for example, have an Excel model, which I got from assessment report. That's not me, sorry. That's not me. Who is that? Sorry. What was I saying? It helps to have certain exercises. I've had, for instance, I've developed a heuristic model really between emissions and temperature, just to point out, I guess, if your emissions, when should it peak? Now, of course, climate models are very sophisticated, but this is really just something simple, just to, again, bring home the point that, it's urgent that we act now. Or even in air quality, you sometimes need all these special filters to do, good science, but then you can also use ordinary paper and engage people in citizen science. Just to make the point, what the transport systems, at least here in Metro Manila, they suffocate people. You can have other such exercises, like even climate risk, because probabilities and chances of harm, usually risk is associated with hazards. Then we say, no, it also depends on vulnerability. You may have an intense hazard, but then if your vulnerability is high, then the chances of harm are high. Anyway, to conclude, just this first stab at open science, I just like to say that, well, it doesn't help to be a doomsayer. Doomsayers depress and they paralyze action. And many scientists, they revel in telling us, Houston, we have a problem, and how complicated the problem is. I think in climate science, scientists need to check themselves whether they are spending more time in diagnosis than prognosis, in analysis rather than solutions. And speaking of predictions, I mean, we have some hard lessons here. Just because something is forecast to happen does not mean that people will act on it. I don't think we can ever exhaust the physical causes of something so complex as climate change. But again, that's no reason not to act. Climate change is a wicked problem, and it will take more than experts in the kitchen to deal with it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Jet, for again highlighting the importance of engaging other fields and disciplines, sectors, and the citizens, and even hinting on the role of hope in communicating about our climate future. But thank you very much to our dear panelists for sharing your reflections, and I think that really provides us with very fertile ground to further the discussion. I'm sure that we've latched on to some very interesting experiences and insights. So I'm happy to move to the open forum. So once again, we invite everyone who wishes to send in their questions or comments to please feel free to do so in the comments in the chat box here in Zoom. All right, so we will now read some questions we've gathered from the chat thus far. The first one is from Ping Sampulme, and it's a question specifically directed to JL, our first panelist. The question reads, aside from accessing open science research, how can grassroots sectors or communities who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate risks specifically benefit from this open climate science?
Jean, thank you for that question. Also, Sir Ping, good afternoon. How are you doing? Nice to see you again here. Anyway, just to answer your question, for me, as an example, I suppose, just to give you a bit of a more specific situation that applies to certain cases. For example, let's say there's a certain research group that is funded to analyze a specific issue, let's say biodiversity conservation. And the research can be designed such that it becomes more community-based, in the sense that it becomes vital for the researchers to involve the community itself throughout the study proper. For example, they can involve the community in data collection, monitoring of certain sampling sites, analysis, even some parts of the analysis, like, for example, how does higher temperatures influence the behavior of certain species that are present in a particular ecosystem. And then you can also help them in identifying issues that are encountered during the study along the way. I'm talking about the community to the researchers. For me, by doing that, it provides certain benefits. Like, first is a certain sense of ownership. Ownership by the community in the findings of the study that may also help them identify angles and even potentially other issues that the community may not have known before, and may not have known if it wasn't for the presence of the researchers there, because they help identify certain angles. And it also helps empower the community to continue monitoring their respective neighborhoods or nearby forests or whatever the study site may be, which could enhance their initial study in the long term. And again, as I mentioned earlier, in service of society, make stronger calls and recommendations for climate-related policies and solutions. And of course, it also helps that it may even inspire a certain generation of scientists from that community as well. That could also help further protect the interests of their particular community. That would be my answer to that question.
Thank you very much, JL. So on the topic of communities and including them, here's a question, but it's directed specifically to Dr. Jack regarding central authority in addressing a perceived problem. This one is specifically on the problem of having a diversity of sources. Might there be a benefit to having different sources to arrive to a more robust decision, since different research institutions might have varying assumptions and methods for the same context? This question is from Dr. Gatanco Gonzalez. She also wrote, I wonder if a potential complementary solution would be in scientific literacy in education, building skills to critically evaluate different sources and synthesize insights.
Thanks, Kendra. It's a really interesting question. I think this one often comes up around the authority. And I guess the easiest answer is yes, definitely, to all of them. Scientific literacy is, I think, always a good thing and will get us a lot further. But I think the diversity of information and how that gets brought into the process, I like to talk about the process, is really key, because often the way these projects are set up and funded and the partnerships are brought together, there will be a climate science group or person or institution that is part of a consortium that is implementing this research project, which is often the way it works, or a consultancy or some kind of structure like that. And that science expertise comes in very opinionated. And again, thank you, Father, for pointing out this thing of self-awareness, not necessarily aware of the strength of their opinion and the strength of their commitment to their particular framing, their particular models, their particular set of assumptions that they're making. So I think there's quite a deep underlying challenge here around how the authority of science comes into these spaces. So I'm really advocating increasingly that when projects are brought together and partnerships are brought together, that we try and address that a little bit, and scientists should be brought on to bring in the expertise to evaluate the diversity of information, not to bring in their particular perspective and assumptions. And that's really, really difficult for scientists. It begs some questions of how these processes are funded and the funding mechanisms and how consortiums are constructed. But yes, I think we need to push more for that, evaluating a diversity of perspectives. And it may turn out that the best science output for this particular application comes from a different institution that's not your institution, and you actually need to be in a position to be able to say that and bring that in. Thanks. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jack. Maybe we can also hear from Doc Lenny, similarly to follow up to this question, since you mentioned that you would look for secondary information aside from what PAGASA, the Met agency in the Philippines, would provide.
Yes, in the Philippines, we usually rely on our national government technical agencies for the data that will be used in our planning purposes. But we do supplement it with additional research from we mentioned from what we can get from open sources to be able just to contextualize more what is happening on the ground, especially if there are already existing research in that particular area. So these scientific studies can supplement more on the appropriate ways to look at how we should do our planning, what strategies we should pursue, and how what interventions should be undertaken by both the local government communities. But yeah, in our case, usually there's the issue because so many things have happened in the past of information from CSOs being integrated into planning that were not vetted by our technical agencies, and that led to some damage or something. So among the NDRRMC, there's the agreement that we can only use information that has been approved, generated by our national government technical agencies.
All right, thank you very much for that, Dr. Lenny. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to cover all of the questions we received, as we've also received some from the Facebook Live. If it's all right for our panel members, maybe send these questions to you and we can forward your response to our audience members who asked them. I hope that is fine with everyone. But maybe before we end, let's just ask one question for all of the panelists, actually. So maybe we can have a short answer from each one. As Father Jet mentioned, there are philosophical and sociological perspectives of science, which would be helpful to scientists to appreciate, just like being aware of who are privileged and who are marginalized and how that might influence the practice of science. But this is often not part of the formal training of scientists. What innovations might be introduced to address this? So maybe we can have a round among the scientists. Maybe we can hear first from Ms. Fiona Spuller.
Yeah, sure. I think just as a short answer, I would share a personal experience that I had. I mean, I just started my PhD and actually took part in a philosophy of science training course, which was offered by an academic at the University of Reading, who felt very strongly that this should be part of the formal training and was trying to motivate PhD students to take part. And this is something I think that changed my perspective and that I think could maybe become sort of a part of the formal PhD training in my case, or more formal training overall, if you want to become a scientist, to be aware of your positionality and all of those things.
Great, thank you very much, Fiona. Father Jet? Would you like to?
I agree with Fiona. I'm fortunate because I did receive philosophy of science training, but it does help to knowing to know, as someone said, the science of science, which is really epistemology, the science or the field of knowing. How people arrive at their constructs, their paradigms, etc. So that, and I guess conversations, what I call transdisciplinary conversations. I'm fortunate. I live. I'm a priest. I am a Jesuit, so I live in a community of well, we're brothers, and we have our different fields, and some are psychologists or historians or theologians, and so that helps to be immersed in such environments, that because translation is always ongoing, not just on the part of the scientists, but also on their part, on the part of the non-science person. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Jet. Mr. Algo?
Just to paraphrase what Father Jet said earlier, break the walls down, open the doors, build the bridges. Basically, well, for my personal case, I'm very grateful for the kind of education I've had in Ateneo, and being able to learn from the likes of Doc Kendra and Father Jet and Jean as well. And I'm not just saying that because they're here. I really mean that. And for me, it boils down to being more socially active and socially relevant. You can probably, since you're asking about innovations, you can probably start by ensuring that starting at the training level, maybe at the collegiate courses for training the next generation of scientists, you can strengthen the philosophical and sociological relevant subjects to really enforce that holistic and comprehensive approach and attitude that will be instilled within the scientists, so that when they graduate and they move on to further studies and other disciplines for that matter, they're already equipped with that, again, sociological and philosophical mindset that allows them to be adaptable and responsive to issues, especially in the context of the climate crisis being multifaceted. And of course, even now, I think you can also strengthen the social relevance of your research, such that in terms of prioritizing, for example, in a research institution, what kinds of topics you want to tackle. You can probably ensure that the more socially relevant topics will be addressed first. I think that's another innovation that can be done as well.
Okay, thank you, JL. Dr. Jack, would you like to weigh in on that as well?
Great, thanks. It's hard to add on to all of that. I agree with all of that. I think that it needs to be a much broader basis of philosophy, of history, even touching into sociology. I think it would be great if climate scientists had that much broader underpinning. I agree with everything else that's been said. I think the only thing I would add is it is difficult to be an academic and to pursue an academic career while trying to work in this way, try and work transdisciplinary, to engage in socially relevant research. It's often slow and it's difficult to publish. I can speak from experience. It's quite difficult to get publications out. So I think that's a challenge that those who are in a position to influence and a position to provide leadership and guidance could play a really key role in trying to help young academics find a way of progressing in their career while working in a very different kind of way. That's all I'd add. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jack. And finally, Dr. Uy.
I think it has been said, but what I can add is that there are already call for action to have all our engagement inclusive, all of society, following all of society approach, being participatory, being transdisciplinary. So I think in this way we'll be able to get the communities in our fold and make them contribute to whatever strategies we are doing. It's also for their well-being anyway, so might as well listen to them and hear what they have to say in all these things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much once again to our dear panelists. And all this whole webinar on open science of particular relevance to this event is, of course, the conference that the World Climate Research Program will be hosting this year in Kigali, Rwanda, the Open Science Conference. Tell us more about the conference. We would like now to hand the virtual floor over to Dr. Nico Caltabiano, the Scientific Officer of the World Climate Research Program Secretariat. Dr. Caltabiano, thank you for being here and to share more about this.
Thank you very much, guys, for inviting me and giving the opportunity to share a little bit more details for the Open Science, for the WCRP Open Science Conference. So I'm just before I give a little short presentation, I'm going to play a video to try to catch your attention to see and try to invite you to go and come, or to go to Kigali and join us at the conference. So I'm just going to share my screen here. I hope you all can see the screen.
Yes, we see it.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to play the video now.
Climate change is happening now. We need to protect ourselves and plan for the future. The 2023 World Climate Research Programme's Open Science Conference is bringing scientists together from all around the world to bridge the gap between scientific knowledge and societal need. Gathering in Rwanda, the heart of Africa, the WCRP Open Science Conference will bring together diverse research communities, programs, and partners to discuss the latest developments in climate science. Using state-of-the-art innovations to gather critical climate data, scientists are empowering communities to anticipate and plan for climate events and work towards a more sustainable climate future.
Whether or not climate change is happening isn't a question. The question now is, how do we respond?
Change is only possible if we all collaborate and work together.
We already seen the extreme events. The intensity is going to increase. More people will suffer. We need to act now. It's a team effort. Join us.
Great. So again, it is good to be here and be able to show a little bit more some details for the Open Science for the WCRP Open Science Conference. So I have a very short presentation that will give you a flavor about the Open Science Conference. So in this spirit of being inclusive and open, the Open Science Conference that will be held on site in Kigali, in Rwanda, as you saw, it will be a hybrid event. So there will be plenty of opportunities for participation online for that. So after my presentation, I'll post the links for the website, and so you can all get more details from there. So the Open Science Conference is going to happen at the Kigali Convention Center. So this is this big dome in multicolor there in Kigali. Is a fantastic venue for that. So I hope you guys can are able to come and join us there. So the program of the WCRP Open Science Conference is built around three themes. The theme 1 on advance on climate research, theme 2 on the human interactions with climate, and theme 3 on co-producing climate services and solutions. So this will bring a full circle for the analyzing the basic climate research, and then bringing the analysis of the key drivers, and then connecting to knowledge and scientific knowledge, and even decision making for communities. So it is a full circle that will connect all these themes within the program for the conference. So we have a very busy timeline for the conference. And I will give a little bit more details at the end for some of these deadlines, particularly for abstract submission. So it's going to be a very busy week for the Open Science Conference, starting early in the morning with plenary sessions. We will have 5 parallel sessions per day in the morning and in the afternoon. A particular important part of the Open Science Conference are the poster sessions that will happen in Kigali, but because of it is a hybrid event, we will also have online poster sessions that will happen before the week or 2 weeks before the Open Science Conference, to give a full dedicated forum for the online posters. And we will also have many side events, both during the lunchtime and in the evening. So it is a full program that will make sure that there is a good interaction, integration of different communities that will be represented there in Kigali. So the key features of the program, as I said, in the spirit of this openness for the Open Science Conference, is going to be virtual and on-site participation with keynotes by leading scientists, policymakers, and practitioners. So it's not only about the science, but how you apply the science and how you understand the needs from society, bring back to a further evolution of the science. As I mentioned, there will be a virtual poster gallery with dedicated sessions and opportunities for many side events and workshops. One particularly interesting aspect for the Open Science Conference is that we will have the weekend before, or the Sunday before the Open Science Conference, and the Sunday, the Saturday after the Open Science Conference, or during the week, the early to mid-career research symposium. There's a dedicated team of early and mid-career researchers that are building a program. But basically, the day one for the symposium on Sunday, the 22nd of October, they will discuss, give an introduction about the WCRP and the whole program. There will be breakout sessions about the themes of the Open Science Conference, dedicated discussion on climate resilience, focus on Africa. We will be in Africa, so that will be very important. And the workshops of major interest for the early and mid-career researchers. During the week of the Open Science Conference, the early and mid-career researchers will be actively engaged in the sessions as well as keynote speakers or presenting their posters. And there will be two specific side events on Tuesday and Wednesday on table topics for further discussion within this community. And to finalize, on day two of the symposium, which will be on Saturday after the Open Science Conference, there will be discussions on the outcomes of the Open Science Conference and a brainstorm potentially for an article to be written on the spirit of how climate science and society can connect through the view of the early and mid-career researchers. So deadlines, we have the call for abstracts open at the moment with deadline of the 28th of February, so end of this month. So I'll give a little bit more details in the next slide. So it's very likely that we may postpone the deadline for application for posters, for abstract submissions. But for now, it's 28th of February, so keep in touch and keep looking at our website for further announcements. Through the process, it's where you submit your abstract, and you also can apply for limited financial support that we have, and also for a place in the early mid-career research symposium. Just for definition, the early career we define as those within 7 years of their latest degree, and mid-career between 8 and 15 years of their latest degrees. So when you submit an abstract, you can submit as an oral or poster presentation for the parallel sessions. But you do have also poster clusters, which are dedicated specific topics that you can submit for your poster. So everything is on the website. You can have a look at the description of all the sessions and posters as well. So just to clarify that if you are submitting an abstract, you must be the presenter. So either in person or online. So there will be the opportunity for online presentations as well, if you are selected for an oral presentation. And as I said, there's limited financial support for early and mid-career researchers and those from low and lower middle income countries as well. So our website is a living environment where further news will be posted all the time there. So please keep a look at the website for further information. Engage with us through social media if possible. So we really expect to see you all in Kigali, either online or hopefully in person there, where we plan to really launch new WCRP partnerships and initiatives, and to discuss, develop these transformative solutions that need to bridge the gaps between climate science and society, but more importantly, across science disciplines and with the spirit of an open environment for all to contribute to this development. So I'll stop here. It's a very short message. So I really hope to see you guys there in Kigali with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Caltabiano. I'm sure that is of great interest to many of our participants. The link to the website of the conference is also now posted in chat. Thank you very much. Now to deliver the closing remarks, may we call on Dr. Theodore Shepard and Dr. Regina Rodriguez, co-chairs of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program.
Hi, so I'll go first. This is Ted here, and very interesting session, I have to say, webinar. We've been really thrilled with how Ateneo has really been leading the way, I think, with the involvement of our various My Climate Risk hubs. You've had a great series of webinars, and this is certainly one of them. I'll just start, and I'll use first names. I hope that's okay with you. Kendra began by, if I got it right, highlighting 4 aspects of openness: open for participation, open for transparency of tools, verifiability, and so on, open for communication, including open access, and open for meaning. I think most scientists think about the middle 2 of those, and that's what our journals are doing, of course, with codes and open access. The research councils are insisting on this. And I looked at the OECD definition of open science, and it really seemed to just focus on those 2. It didn't focus on the outer bits. So that's very interesting. JL defined openness as service to society, which was interesting. You don't find that in the OECD definition, but of course, service to society is part of the motto of the WCRP, and he emphasized that we need to address the problems in the research culture itself. Kristen did an interesting turn on the climate science as if people mattered, and argued that the its complicated phrase is a bit of a cover, and of course it immediately declares the speaker as being the expert, and so he had this interesting inversion, that climate science as if people are experts, which I thought was really interesting. So he was unpacking, if you like, the outer parts of those 4 aspects: the participation and the meaning. Fiona, though, and Noreen, as I saw, unpacked the inner parts, and Fiona talked about the fact that usability means use according to established norms, and we all know that AI builds in all the biases of the people who do the AI and of humans, and so it can lead to inequality, actually. And she emphasized that the need to scale up methodologies to assess bottom-up risk, climate risk, which is exactly what we're trying to do in My Climate Risk. Noreen unpack the open for communication aspect, which can be exclusive, and in terms of which knowledge or data is acknowledged. For example, it's the same issue with peer review, that if something has to be peer review, that can be exclusionary, and being open in this official definition can be exclusionary as well. She talked about the need to represent both qualitative and quantitative information, including in the databases, which of course is a challenge, because it's not just a question of the how, it's the why, and the need to improve data literacy, which is another theme within My Climate Risk. And for the Jet, finally, he began by defining open as an opposition to closed, and he saw closed as being the elite scientific method, which privileges the how and deprivileges the why. And I think it's clear that philosophy of science and sociology of science and so on are all talking about these outer parts of the openness that Kendra talked about, but there's definitely a lot of resistance. And I mean, most climate scientists I know still have problems with the outer parts. I just read this. Oh, maybe you can't see it because of my background. Michael Strevens, The Knowledge Machine. Maybe it's just coming through. He's a philosopher at New York University, who basically argues that we have to lobotomize ourselves and forget why we're doing things, throw out the values and forget the reasoning and focus on the arguments, and his arguments for efficiency. So it's not dead. And in my experience, a lot of even research councils that will pay lip service to these outer parts of the openness, actually, when it comes to getting things funded, getting past peer review, and so on, it comes back. So I think we still have a need to work on this. And the final thing I picked up from Father Jet was the need for stories, which of course is very dear to the heart of my climate risk. So with that, I'll thank you very much and pass to Regina.
Hi, I'm Brigida Rodriguez from the Federal University of Santa Catarina in southern Brazil, and I co-chair my climate risk with TED. So I would like to thank the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability for this wonderful webinar. My comment is just that I'm going to give a brief, small experience that I have that highlights all that being discussed here. I live in an island that is very touristic and has a lagoon, and my neighborhood is in front of the lagoon. And we have an incident with fish mortality. And my neighbor, that is a very active person, she actually told me and sent me pictures and asked me to contact people, because I'm an oceanographer and I'm in the oceanography department, contact people in university to try to tell them, right? And she took several pictures because she lives in the lagoon forever and she is every day there. She rows, she swims there. And so when I passed to my colleagues in the university, they just said, oh yeah, give her the report that we've done about the conditions of the lagoon. And I said, wait, I'm not, it's not that way. She's giving you the information, help you perhaps, right? So anyways, I was shocked with the reaction because they want to like, oh yeah, give her the report and we have some webinar about the conditions of the lagoon recently. And I was like, no. She knows, she lives here, right? And so then she started collecting. The good thing is that she started collecting water for them, because for the professors are hard to come and collect it, and she's every day here. And this start a partnership. So she now the community collect water, and they take to them, and they do the analysis, the sample analysis, and this helped with the reports. And now they can pressure the sewage company to do the treatment, because the pressure from tourism and is getting worse, and the sewage is not treat. And really what I want to bring it from this experience is the lack actually of awareness of our scientists. And this is we have to change. And I think one of the solutions, I understand, Chris, we are overwhelmed with everything as a professor. We have to do a lot of things already, and it's one more thing that we would have. But I think for me, one solution, I think we have to talk about solutions, is the postgrad courses here, which are students that are already going to start their academic life or want to continue. We should have one short course on this subject, on the social aspect, on this, or the openness, or the importance of society. I think this would be something that it doesn't overwhelm us so much. But if we put it a short course in as a requirement, because we have here in our postgrad courses a requirement to have a certain amount of credits of disciplines, right? And 1 or 2 credits on a subject would, because it's so obvious when I'm listening to you saying all these aspects, and if you have a course that someone tells this story, and I don't think anyone will ever forget and do the research without thinking anymore about the bits that really are important. So that's it. And thank you again for the webinar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shepherd and Dr. Rodriguez, for closing this event. Really for putting together all the insights, all the sharing from all the speakers, and sharing with us as well your personal experiences with how we can make and empower everyone to be part of open climate science. At this point, we would like to express our gratitude once again to all the panel members, to JL, to Fiona, to Dr. Jack, to Dr. Lenny and to Father Jet. We would also like to thank our sign language interpreters today, Ms. Edna Comia and Ms. Analisa Regis Tolentino, and to everyone who have been here. We went a little over time, but you stayed on. Thank you very much for being here, and we hope that you have gained fresh and valuable insights on the meanings and practice of open science and its role in addressing the climate crisis. Flashed on screen are QR codes, some QR codes for our link tree in the MCR Hub of the Ateneo, and very importantly, to the event evaluation form. We greatly appreciate your feedback, and we hope that you could accomplish the event evaluation form. Requests for e-certificates may be coursed to the same form. Once again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And that is it for today's session. Enjoy the rest of the day.